Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. August, we're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done, and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right.
Well-known Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson has come out with a brand new book entitled We Who Wrestle with God, subtitled Perceptions of the Divine. Sean, you and I have wrestled seriously with this book. It's a massive tome, but with lots of really good insights and I think lots to talk about in terms of our interaction with him. So let's jump in here. First, tell our audience here, who is Jordan Peterson, in case you've had your head in the sand for the last decade and have never heard of him. Who is he, and why is he so popular?
Jordan Peterson is a psychologist. He's a mega best-selling author, speaker, influencer. He's from Canada, and he's really become one of the leading voices today that you might say, this might be too simplistic, but kind of the anti-woke crowd that's pushed back against certain ideas that have popped up. He's emerged as this voice, and I think part of his popularity, number one, he's just brilliant. He's brilliant. There's many times reading his book, hearing him speak, where you have these like aha, light bulb go on kind of moments.
That happened regularly with this book.
And he just sees things a way a lot of people don't. I think that attributes to it. Second, he's bold. He partly launched into kind of public awareness, I don't know, maybe it was 7 years ago or so, where he was being forced in Canada or being told to use preferred pronouns. And it wasn't that he wouldn't do it personally for somebody, but the idea of the government forcing somebody to do so. He stood in the gap and was like, nope. So he's fought back against a lot. I mean, he writes in the book about certain totalitarian ideas that are repressive. He's a bold guy who's just stood up and said no more. But
and it's cost him. Too.
It has cost him personally.
It's cost him his license to
emotionally,
practice psychology in Canada.
That's right, which goes into a lot of this book. And I think my third point of why he's so popular is he sees life as a drama. It's like this great unfolding drama. And will you sacrifice? Will you be the hero? Will you step up? And I think especially to a lot of young men who felt beaten down, and in many ways, you might say just white young men who feel like they've been the victim of everything. At least that's how a certain narrative paints it. Jordan Peterson is like, you can be great, you can make a difference, stand up and be bold. And this book writes like you're a part of a drama. I mean, it's not this just kind of cold, analytical take on these stories. He's motivating us to be like Abraham, be like Moses. And I think the last thing is he draws out these points that just, I'm not a psychologist, I know you're not, so maybe to a psychologist it's not that deep, but to me I'm like, wow, that's really helpful. So he's talking about the story of Cain, and he draws out how Cain, once he murders his brother, he could have repented. He could have turned and done what is right, and he doesn't. And so he draws out on by the way, page 189, I accidentally ordered the large print. It wasn't intentional. And I'm 48, so when I saw this, I'm like, oh, actually, this is helpful. I didn't mean to. So my page numbers might not match up with your real copy. But he draws out and he says, we have this aphorism, hurt people hurt people. And I use that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. He says, but also the temptation towards, say, resentment might loom large, particularly when a person has been betrayed as well as damaged. And that's how Cain felt. The pact with sin simply does not have to be made, let alone encouraged, cultivated, and nurtured. In other words, he says, you have agency. You can make a difference. You are not a victim of your genes or some forces outside of you. And I think there's a lot of people that are just resonating with that message. And as you said, his example.
Well, I think for one, that message I think is inspiring.
I think it is.
And I think, we should be fair too. Peterson does have his detractors.
Of course.
Culturally, because there are people who have labeled him as misogynistic, as sexist, as racist. He's sort of. He's got. All of the charges that you could get.
He's a lightning rod
from the culture. He's gotten. But I think what I've found so encouraging about him is his courage in the midst of people who I think largely are mislabeling him. Now he said some things I think that are outside the box.
Sure.
And that we would take issue with, and we'll take issue with a number of things in the book too. But I think he is giving voice to a segment of the culture that I think does feel beaten down and a bit hopeless, and needs to know that no, you can do this.
That's right.
Your genes are not your destiny. Your race or your gender is not your destiny. You can transcend these things. And so, part of it, I understand why he is so popular, and I think why he is such a lightning rod. Mm-hmm. And I think they're just two sides of the same coin.
They probably go together in our provocative social media culture. They tend to go together.
Well, and he's good. Right. He's good at being provocative.
He is,
no doubt,
100%.
But I think once you dig a little deeper, beyond the headline that he's making, I think you see there's a lot of thought and a lot of wisdom, and I just found lots of places where I said, "Wow, this is just brilliant." What he said.
Good.
So anyway, I found I had to work hard to get there.
Yeah. And by the way, I read that he said this. At least my book is like 700 pages. He turned in a 1,500-page manuscript, and they trimmed it down to this. How many pages is that real hard? It's like 500-ish.
Yeah,
with
or low 500s.
3 times that length he turned in and trimmed it down. So there was even more.
All right. So, Sean, just summarize for our audience here, what is this book about? Because I think you could probably subtitle it, God, the Universe, and Other Related Matters. Because it just touches. It touches.
Yes.
There's hardly anything that got left untouched. Maybe some of the, maybe some abstract chemistry or physics.
Fair enough.
But that's about it.
So he's taking these key biblical stories from the Old Testament, although the New Testament is all riddled through it. And one thing I appreciate is that he sees the Old Testament, New Testament as being deeply tied together on their themes. Oftentimes, whether it's the new atheists or whether it's other critics who divorce them, he's like, no, there are common themes running through this. So he cites Jesus in the New Testament all the time, but he's taking the creation story, Cain and Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jonah, and he's looking at them through what you might call kind of an archetypal narrative lens.
Which being translated means...
So he's not saying, did these happen historically, and is there archaeology that supports it? He's saying, what lessons do we learn about the human condition? What morals can we draw from this? So when he looks at Cain and Abel, he'll break down and he'll say things like, okay, what's the difference between somebody who works with animals and somebody who works with the land? well, there's a difference in their psychology between Cain and Abel. I'd never really thought about that, but that's the lens that he brings. So on my page 362, he says, in the story of Cain and Abel, God is the highest good to which sacrifice must be devoted, and the Spirit who admonishes when the best is not forthcoming. That's kind of the moral he draws out of it. The Tower of Babel God is characterized as the spirit that must be ensconced at the very top. Otherwise, everything will catastrophically disintegrate. The story of Abraham is this call to adventure and leaving comfort behind. So he looks at these different stories and just draws out these big life lessons from them, but connects them with other literature. He's always bringing in like the Terminator movies or Pinocchio or other religions, because he's kind of seeing these universal moral themes about the human condition, but uses the biblical text because he considers them kind of the founding texts of Western culture through which to understand those ideas.
I found it very encouraging with how familiar he is with the Bible.
I agree.
And I think his familiarity with the Bible puts some of our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ to shame, because it's not quite, we can talk about this a little bit further too, it's not quite clear whether he believes all of it is true.
That's right.
But there's no doubt that it has some sort of transcendent value. And it's the kind of thing that demands his close attention. Now we'll talk further about how he handles the biblical text. There's a whole story for that.
Yep.
But I found it very respectful that he was so familiar with the biblical text and connected a lot of dots that maybe the average person in the pew that doesn't connect and doesn't hear connected in their preaching. So I found that really helpful.
I agree. His command of the text was remarkable.
All right. Now you made reference to the way the new atheists sort of separate Old and New Testament. How does overall that's one area that contrasts. But how would you say that Peterson's approach to the biblical text compares and contrasts with Dawkins, Sam Harris, the new atheist crowd?
This is a really interesting question because Justin Brierley wrote a book on kind of the rise and fall, or he calls it the surprising rebirth of belief in God, and how from like early 2000s to maybe mid 2010s, people like Dennett and Dawkins and Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens dominated the conversation about God. And these are firm, strong, committed materialists and atheists who have nothing really but disdain for the Judeo-Christian tradition. Their approach in this, or Peterson's approach, is completely different. He holds the text with a sense of kind of reverence, a sense of learning from it, a sense of respect, a sense of like, let's dive in and learn from this. Now, for example, the new atheists would say, well, what about like in the Old Testament, you had things like warfare. There can't be a God. And Dawkins famously calls him all these kind of adjectives to just attack him personally. Peterson brings that up in the text and he goes, it raised the question, how could a God command this? But he doesn't raise that until he's dove really deep on what's going on in the story. How is God presented? Rather than writing this off, might there be a warning for us about how we're to relate to the divine? Like he's just approaching this so differently. And as I was reading this, I thought, you know what? The new atheist critiques are so shallow and they're so minimalist and they don't even take the time to understand, not for the most part, the deep richness of these texts and how they've shaped all of Western society. They just nitpick these areas that are difficult areas. And Peterson's like, no, we got to dive in and look at the depth and the meaning. And he'll talk about how Western culture itself is built upon these kinds of ideas. So to me, I'm just reading through this. I mean, it says, this is the story on which Western civilization is predicated. You never read a New Atheist say that. The biblical story in its totality is the frame through which the world of facts reveals itself, insofar as the West itself is concerned. He says, the Bible is the library of stories in which the most productive, freest, and most stable and peaceful societies the world has ever known are predicated. The foundation of the West, plain and simple. So basically, you have the New Atheist saying, if we could just get rid of God, get rid of religion, it brings bigotry, hatred, bloodshed, then we'd be happy. And Peterson's like, wait a minute. Everything good about Western culture is predicated on these stories. Let's spend 500 to 1,000 pages wrestling with what this means and what life lessons we might garner from it. So that shift in the conversation in itself just made me so happy, for lack of a better term.
Well, I think there's good evidence that some of the New Atheists have shifted also. Because Dawkins has come out not too long ago and basically said, I don't believe any of this stuff is true, but I wouldn't want to live in a culture that didn't take this stuff seriously.
Said that.
So maybe that some of Dawkins' more recent reflections, have anticipated some of the things that Peterson has done in much greater depth, which I find very encouraging.
I think so too. And I want to give one other example is at the root of like Dawkins is just this entrenched conflict between science and faith. They're completely at odds. Peterson's got this like 5-page section that just intrigued me on the parallels between prayer and secularized thought. So rather than saying they're odds, he's saying, I wonder what they have in common. He says, first, there's an admission of insufficiency. If you pray, you have insufficiency. If you're a scientist, insufficiency. You must be beset by a problem. You must believe that the problem is worth addressing. You must have faith that such an answer can be found or resolved. And he intentionally used the word faith. He said even on both sides, there's an apprenticeship of somebody learning how to pray, learning how to do science. He says there's the willingness on the part of the thinker to sacrifice previous conceptualizations in the pursuit of truth. He says the scientist must open himself up to a hypothesis that can be corrected. I mean, he goes on. And his final one is then the scientist and the believer are both kinds of evangelists for what they believe. So I don't want people to miss how radically this conversation is shifting as Peterson addresses it. So there's an openness and a welcomeness to science and faith rather than just attacking it and trashing it. And I think that's in part what people positively see in Peterson.
Yeah, and I think, as we've said before, that science and faith are not in conflict. It's the philosophy of science and Christian faith, the philosophy of philosophical naturalism, that what we perceive with our senses is all that there is in terms of reality. That's what conflicts with Christian faith. But there's no conflict between science well done and faith properly understood. It's more on the philosophical side that there is that conflict, and that's not breaking news to our listeners and viewers. But I think it's important to recognize that I think that's the way Peterson would view it also.
I think that's right. What's breaking news is someone so significant as Peterson helping to shift the conversation. And he attributes much of the scientific revolution, if I read him correctly, to beliefs in Western culture that come from the Judeo-Christian tradition.
That's absolutely true.
Now, one more thing I just got to draw out.
Go for it.
And this is kind of in my lane a little bit, but how different this is from the New Atheist. He says, page 428, whatever that means. He says, it is...
To me, in my version, nothing.
He said, it is instead religious contrasting with the sexual revolution. It's religious married couples who appear to have the most active sex lives. A more ironically comical psychological or sociological empirical observation is hardly imaginable this far into the 1960s inspired sexual revolution. And then the next page, he says, if sex is devoted to God, then all shame and fear thereof vanishes, and the spirit of true play can emerge with full and enthusiastic enjoyment.
Brilliant.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
I get goosebumps thinking about like the openness to these conversations. And then, okay, what does it mean for sex to be devoted to God? That's the next conversation. But Peterson is pushing and pulling on these ideas that I think are, number one, fascinating, but true, just give us hooks to engage our culture from a biblical perspective.
Now, let's be clear, too, for our viewers, that what he's doing here, he gets a deep dive into basically Genesis and Exodus. Mm-hmm. A particularly deep dive into about Genesis 1 to 4 with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And I thought the part he talks about in Genesis 11 on the Tower of Babel, absolutely brilliant.
It's fascinating.
Absolutely brilliant about the trend toward totalitarianism. And then we get a lot on the life of Moses. But then it's just not so much after that. There's a little bit of stuff on the rest of the other 3 books of the Pentateuch. And then there's a significant chapter on Jonah and his going to Nineveh. So this is not, it starts out like it's going to be this really deep dive into all of the Old Testament. That's not where
it's selective.
It's
that's
very
right.
selective.
That's right.
But one of the things that is not, it's not really a focus of his work, but it helps frame the discussion of Moses, Abraham, Jonah, and other characters, is the story about Elijah. And that I took that as really one of the central parts of the narrative that he's trying to recreate here. So how do you see the story of Elijah, and how is that important for understanding some of these other characters that we get these real significant deep dives into?
This is a really important question because he opens with an analysis of Elijah. And he talks about how he defeats the prophets of Baal. And he talks about a bunch of other things that are interesting. For example, he talked about, like with Elijah, how when King Ahab is being wicked, he's promised that there's no rain. It won't rain for a while. And so when somebody wicked reigns, it affects the physical ground, which we see in The Lion King. When the king is deposed from his brother, there's a drought. Like, he makes these just super cool connections that I find fascinating. So he comes this moment where Elijah has defeated the prophets of Baal, flees to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, and then God appears to him in the earthquake, appears to him in the wind, appears to him in the fire. And you have this moment of this still small voice. Now, he interprets this, that God is not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but it's the voice of conscience itself. And then he takes that voice of conscience and says Abraham was responding to the voice of conscience. Jonah was responding to the voice of conscience. Moses was responding to the voice of conscience. Now, if you just read this story in 1 Kings 19, it's not about him having his conscience. He doesn't go sit on the mountain and reflect within and have this feeling, though ironically some Christians interpret it this way. This was an audible voice. Right. If you were there with Elijah, you would have heard the wind and felt it, seen the fire, felt the earthquake, and actually heard that audible voice. And so removing God speaking objectively to Elijah allows him, I think, somewhat to universalize these stories and say that is the kind of still small voice. God is all calling us to adventure. God is all calling us to this. And so that gave me pause, because if that frames the way he looks at all of these different heroes, I'm thinking, wait a minute. These are real historical figures called by God audibly to a particular task. And I think this is an example where he's kind of importing a certain worldview onto the text itself rather than let the text speak for itself. That gave me pause right at the beginning, especially because it comes through like a thread in all these different stories.
Sean, this raises one of the main questions that I have about how he's understanding the text. I think he's done a yeoman's job in trying to really get at what the author intended. I think the value that he sees is largely in the overarching worldview that is being communicated by this narrative, and what kind of lessons that the characters have for a person who's trying to live a flourishing life. But it's not clear to me that he's actually doing full justice to the author's intent, and I think there are probably some places where I think he's taken some hermeneutical liberties.
Agreed.
With the text, because he wants to shape it into a mold that is somewhat less supernatural than it actually is, and therefore able to be received by people who want to be skeptical about the supernatural part. But as we've talked about numerous times, the supernatural part is what gives it its transcendent value. And I so appreciate him wanting to elevate the worldview within the narrative to a transcendent place. And he's got a lot of different names for God that I found odd. He calls him the spirit of being. Conscience is the voice of God is called conscience. The spirit of being and becoming, and there's a whole host of these. And it just raised the question for me: to what degree does he believe that these narratives are actually historical, in the same way that we would talk about, the Abrahamic narrative being historically accurate, or the creation narrative being a matter of space, time, and history. That's less clear to me, and although I think, to be honest, I think he gets a lot of mileage out of the biblical narrative without necessarily being clear about whether he believes that it's true or not. I think he believes that it's relevant, and that it is timeless, and that it has a whole lot to say that's insightful about the human condition, especially how we deal with struggle, and how we deal with adversity, and how we flourish in the midst of those things. Because after all, almost all of the characters that he describes, they have a pretty familiar narrative to their lives.
They do, yeah.
And I think what I'd want to emphasize, and I think this is for our listeners who have, maybe pastors who teach on different characters in the Bible and people who listen to those messages, almost without exception, the hero of all of those stories is not the character in the script. It's God who's the hero. And in many cases, it's God who is the hero and who accomplishes things in spite of the shortcomings of the characters, not because of them. And I think that I think is an overall point that gets lost. That I think is the central focus of these narratives. Now, I think there's a lot that we can glean, and he has gleaned some incredibly insightful things.
For sure,
really good stuff, and he's applied it to matters of politics and culture and economics that we don't often hear from our pulpits.
That's right.
And I wish, in fact, maybe this may be stretching it a bit, but I would like to see us teach Bible exposition in some of the ways he's doing it, by bringing out the relevance of the text, the relevance of the author's intent to matters of cultural importance, matters of how society is structured, matters of how government is done. I think you can do that without being partisan. He's clearly not being partisan here. At best, he is partisan toward liberal, a small L liberal democracy, sort of classic liberalism of the founding fathers of America. And I think he's right to get that essentially from the biblical narrative. I'm not sure the founding fathers had specific chapter and verse in mind.
Yeah.
But they clearly had the overall big story of the Bible that you can get from natural law as part of the founding. And I think he's rightly recognized that and gone into, I think, pretty significant depth in the analysis of that. Now, whether all of that can be drawn from the biblical text is another matter.
Yes.
And I think in most of these cases, the biblical text is a jumping off place that enables him to go into
I think that's right.
into a direction that he wants to go
Yeah.
that probably was not where the biblical author was intending it. But I'm not sure the biblical authors would actually stand up and object to some of the applications that are being made, even though they might put it that this is true, but it's not derived from that
From
text.
the text itself. Yeah. I think that's a really fair point. In some ways, he's thinking biblically about a whole host of issues and draws out principles from Cain and Abel. And then he'll draw the connection to, like, Karl Marx had this kind of spirit within him, the Cain spirit within him. And he'll explain, for example, like Cain and Abel, it was jealousy. Well, you look at the story of Marxism, there's a kind of jealousy that's built in. There's haves and there's have-nots. I want what you have. You can't have more and be better. We're going to make everything equal. So he walks through, like, this spirit of Lucifer that he calls it, lived out through Cain, that you see in Marxism. I mean, that's completely brilliant. He gives the example of, like, some of the Pharisees and how modern day protesters are just out proclaiming their goodness and their virtue to the world. And we talk about virtue signaling. That is a clear Pharisaical spirit.
Those are dots I'd never connected.
Yeah, that's
exactly what it is.
I think it's brilliant. Now, this is a whole separate conversation, but you're right. In terms of what he thinks about truth, he doesn't define truth in the way you and I as philosophers wish that he would. In many ways, he kind of has a pragmatic approach to truth. He'll say things like, if this not these words, but if this helps humans flourish the most, then it's got to be true. But what he means by true is it just describes and characterizes the human condition, not something that matches up objectively with reality the way we would define it as a whole.
I think he's closer to that than you might think.
Now, I was going to keep going because I think he dances around that kind of pragmatic approach. But then there's moments where he makes these connections, and I wrote a few of them down where it's like, this actually describes society. Reality, and he'll use that term. Exactly. So there's kind of this tension between the two of them that is in the book. Now, interestingly enough, he's had some interviews with atheists like the Cosmic Skeptic, who's done as good a job as anybody. Like, he was playing the role of the Christian, who's kind of remarkable, and he's pushing him going, okay, if they had a camera at the tomb, would they see Jesus physically walk out, trying to get his view of truth? And he kind of danced around it and didn't want to answer it. I don't know why, but I think he basically believes we can draw these principles out of him, whether they're true or not. And Christians are saying, yes, many of these principles we can draw, but it's also true. So this isn't just a story. This is the story of reality. So I appreciate he starts off talking about worldview, although he doesn't use that term. And he kind of defines a worldview as a story, which I thought was profound and accurate the way he's describing this. He said, we have a map to guide our navigation through unknown territory, which would otherwise be lost. We tell a story. He describes how we see the world with our aim. He goes, what is a story? Detail and aim of all of its consequences. It's a description of the structure through which we see the world. So he's right to talk about how there's a story by which we see the world. And then sometimes I think you're correct. There's these moments where he goes, oh, this is actually describing reality. But I would just want to say, I think the disconnect is that he's viewing Christianity as a story that best captures the human predicament. And Christians are going, yes, it does, but it's the objective, true story. And the reason we see parallels in literature throughout the history of the world is because they are reflecting the true story found in Christianity. I don't think he would take it that far.
You may be right. And I think, as far as his understanding of the text and his application goes, I think one of the things I want to caution our viewers about is I think he views the biblical characters as sort of necessarily examples to follow and sins to avoid.
That's right.
And in many cases, I think the example is one to follow, and the sins are ones to avoid. But they're not the point of that particular text. And so the question I'd want to push him to wrestle with, as he's wrestling with the biblical text, is not so much what does the story tell us, but why does the author include that story? What's the purpose for that story being included where it is in the biblical narrative? And that's what gives us the best clue to what the author's point is and what the application should be. So if I could offer just sort of one sort of hermeneutical hint, without having him sit through a whole course on it, but one hermeneutical hint, that's the one I would want to have him give a bit more attention to, and that involves, I think, viewing the text as a narrative. The passages in which he's looking at, view those not as the overall narrative, but as a mini narrative within that passage, and why is the author including that at that particular time? For example, I think with the Tower of Babel, okay, he makes some brilliant, I think, comments that jump off from the Tower of Babel.
Totally.
But the point of the Tower of Babel narrative is to show that once people reject God, not that their languages that their ability to communicate gets confused, which it does, but what the purpose for building the Tower of Babel was to defy God's command to spread out and populate the whole world. Is to keep them together. I think mainly because they failed to trust that God would have their best interest at heart as he sent them out to the various parts of the world. That's the point. And the point of confusing their languages was precisely to get them to spread out and to unify among different language groups and to spread out appropriately so. I'm not sure, although I think his observations about the easy for you to say, totalitarian part of that are accurate and true. I don't think that has much to do with the intent of the narrative of the Tower of Babel. So that'd just be one example where I think you could actually make it much richer in terms of the application if it were more consonant with, I think, the actual intent for why the author included that narrative and and put it in the place that he did.
I think you're getting to the heart at some of my, I don't know if reservations are the right word, but differences and cautions I would have. That he's bringing this psychological perspective, doesn't interact with, as far as I could tell, a lot of biblical commentaries, Jewish or Christian, kind of looks at it through that lens.
Although he does allow other parts of Scripture to comment.
He does, 100%.
On Scripture, which I commend him for that.
He does that very well. Good point. Now, I think sometimes he gets what you said right. Sometimes I would differ. So I was flipping this passage in Exodus 18. So they've come out, around Exodus 14, splitting the Red Sea. They come out of slavery. Exodus 19 into 20, they start to get the law. Well, it says here in Exodus 18, when Moses is judging everybody in the land himself, Jethro, his father-in-law, who's a Midianite, comes in, and it says, "And it came to pass the morrow that Moses had to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning unto evening." And Jethro's like, "This is not good. You need to assign people to their task, have judges." And he's right. Now, we look at this like, of course, that's how society is organized. But this was novel. This was the first time people are answering this. And this is where he gets it right, is he says, this is right before they get the law. So if he's establishing this nation, trying to move into the promised land, they have to have this kind of subsidiarity built into it. And honestly, I hadn't thought about that placement in the story. He's right about it. So I don't think Moses is writing this saying, here's how you should form a civilization in Western culture, but the principles of Western culture derived from this text and get the credit for it. These are some of the kind of points that I think he brings out that are just brilliant.
Well, actually, I don't think it's an accident that you get some of the structure of what civil society was to look like in Old Testament Israel before you get the content of it.
That's exactly the point.
I don't think that's
right.
coincidence.
Now, if I could say, and we're jumping around here with all of our questions, I want to give an example of where I think he missed it. So I think he got it right with Exodus, but given his kind of psychological and archetypical approach, there's sometimes, he would say a lot in the book, he'd say, and this is the moral of the story. And I think, I'm not sure I buy it. So here's an example that on the story of David. So he pulls up the story of David in the midst of the section of the Tower of Babel, which shows just kind of these rabbit trails he goes down, but he brings it back in and he says this, the moral of the story. This is right after David defeats Goliath. He says the true hero is he who defeats the giant tyrant of the state. That's the moral of the story. Now, I had two thoughts. One, I thought, you know what? He's making the same moralistic mistake that a lot of preachers make, looking for some moralistic principle not found in the text. So we see Christians doing the same thing. I mean, I remember a talk I gave, one of my earliest talks was on David and Goliath. Of course, I'm like, what are the giants in your life that God wants to defeat? I look back, I cringe at like my terrible exegesis when I started preaching. But if you go one page earlier in his book, he's citing 1 Samuel 41 through 44. And it says, verse 44, and the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philippines, I don't know why I said that. I love the Philippines. We can edit that one out or not. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. In other words, the purpose of that story is not to defeat the tyrants of the state. The purpose is that the one true God of Israel is the true God. And in that culture, you demonstrate that through military defeat. So he's made David the hero, and in one sense he is, but it's really about God using David to show his supremacy. It's not about defeating the tyrants of the state. Yeah. And I think he makes this mistake a few times.
Well, there's another purpose for that narrative too, because one chapter earlier in 1 Samuel 17 is when David is anointed as king. Mm. And then the first event that takes place after he's anointed as king is his battle with Goliath. Mm. And again, that placement. I mean, it happened historically that way too, but that placement is not a coincidence because that's God's way of saying to David, "I will be with you, and I am validating my choice of you as king by giving you this extraordinary ability to lead your people and to defeat their enemies." Mm. So, I think taking the application of that the way Peterson did, I think is stretching the intent of that text, and I think it shows that sometimes the biblical text is just a jumping off place.
I think that's right.
And I think as long as we recognize some of the hermeneutical limitations of that, I'm basically okay with somebody making what I think are some pretty profound observations that may be true, but not derived specifically from that text.
I think that's well said. Let me give another example that draws this out, just so people see it. He says, now he's talking about Abram. He says, God in the story of Abram is the spirit that calls to the privileged and sheltered to leave the comforts of their home and to undertake the adventure of their life. I'm sorry, but that is not the purpose of the story of Abraham. Now, Abraham did go on an adventure. Yeah. This applied to him, But it's the classic example of taking something that's descriptive in the Bible,
Correct.
making it prescriptive for the rest of us. That's not the point. In drawing out this adventurous spirit about Abraham, as much as I loved it, and you talk about the temptation in Sodom, the conflict, the time that he lies about his wife, there's all this drama built in. It's an amazing story. But really what this is about is God starting his chosen nation, Israel, to be a blessing to the world and ultimately bring his Messiah through Israel. If you miss that as the heart of the story, you miss the heart of the story itself.
And I think to underscore your point, sometimes the biblical characters are unique and not intended to be universalized.
Exactly.
Right? Not everybody's being called to do what God called Jonah to do, which is basically go to the doorsteps of the most implacable enemy of the country and speak a word of judgment. God's not calling everybody to do that. Abraham was a unique character. Moses was a unique character. Now, they have things that we can emulate and things to avoid, but let's don't forget that there's a lot to some of these characters that is not intended to be universalized.
And I think you would concede that, obviously, when you look at some of the faults that are there. And in fact, he does a really good job of drawing out the faults of Moses, the faults of Abraham, the faults of Jonah. And he says, there's a great line in here, I don't remember exactly, but he goes, the best villains are those that are somewhat sympathetic, and the best heroes are those that are not perfect. Now, when I look at these...
That's every biblical hero.
That's every biblical hero.
Significantly flawed.
I would look at that apologetically and say, yeah, that's not only does this ring true archetypically with great stories, but that tells me that these characters are not invented. That's a sign of the failures of these heroes, that they're really human and they're describing reality. I just take that a little step further than he does.
Let's do a couple more things that I think are really important to what he's trying to accomplish here. He talks a lot about belief. Okay, and I looked and looked and thought and tried to figure out exactly what he meant by that, and I came up somewhat empty on that. Did you do any better?
I don't know if I did any better. I wrestled with this because he writes this. He says, what does it mean to believe? I think he says that 3, 4, 5 times throughout the book. We certainly act individually and collectively as if something is true. Like he really has this idea that if you say you believe something and you don't actually really believe it.
Which is completely biblical.
Is fair. I think the philosopher in me is just looking for clarity.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because he's not a philosopher or if he's intentionally talking around certain things to make you think and stir you up and provoke you a little bit. I don't know the answer to that. But I think biblically, if you believe something, it means you hold that something is true. That's what it means to believe. Now, how do we know somebody really believes something? We know it by the fruit of whether they live it out or not. So if I say I value my family, I believe that's true, and I'm a workaholic, Peterson would say, you don't really believe it because you're not living it out. My concern is that this could shift into a kind of works kind of justification and miss that the element of belief and faith is holding that something is true. And I don't justify myself before God at all based on how I live.
Right.
But that fruit should reveal if the belief is really there. So I wish there was a little bit more clarity on this.
I think both those aspects are important. Because, as Paul put it, if Jesus was still in the grave, we're still in our sins.
100%, that's right.
And so there are certain things that you have to acknowledge as cognitively and intellectually true, in the best philosophical sense of that it accords with reality. Okay? But in the New Testament, to believe is much more than that. To believe, and I think he's captured some of that from the New Testament. To believe is to bet your life on it, and to live your life accordingly. And if you don't, then I think we can raise a fair question about maybe not what you believe, but how important is what you believe to you?
At least the depth of that.
The
belief.
depth of it.
Yeah.
You know, I think I mentioned before here that I've often asked, you know, when I'm with families at the end of life, you know, I'll often ask them, do you really believe this stuff that you say you do about resurrection and eternity? Because the way you're holding on to earthly life for your loved one makes me think that you believe something else. I think that's the spirit of what he's getting at here. And I think there's something to be affirmed about that. If you believe to be true the things that the gospel claims, how can you not take those seriously?
I think that's right.
And I think that latter part is what he's getting at while being agnostic about the former.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think you're right. And sometimes evangelicals, as we overemphasize, will just believe something and we don't want to emphasize works at all. He's saying, wait a minute, if you believe it, you're going to bet your life on it. You're going to live out the journey, the drama. And I think that's what's attractive to people in many ways. And I think it brings a good balance to, you know, the way you described it. So, well said.
You ready for one final question?
Sure.
Okay. Would you recommend this book?
So every recommendation that I give is going to be based upon the book itself. Now I want to make one more point if I can.
Go for it.
Because there's a few things that he does in this book. I don't always agree with his conclusions, but he asks some really interesting questions. So in the chapter,
for example.
Yeah, good. So the chapter on Exodus, he says, why is it out of tyranny and slavery and into the desert instead of out of tyranny and into the promised land? Why did they need the season of
Great
the
question.
desert? And he's raising the question that they inculcated certain ideas and patterns that had to be shed away from them before they could enter into the promised land. And there's this sense of, like you think about before the ultimate promised land of heaven, we have to shed out things that are sinful to be prepared to be there. And so he goes on and on talking about how some of the Israelites brought with them a certain effect from slavery where they believed what their oppressors said about them. Hence, they needed the 40 years to have that rid from them. I thought, what a fascinating question for him to raise. Gives another example of one. I love this. I tweeted this out. He says, so this is where you said, is he ridding earlier on like the supernatural element of the scripture? I think there's times where it bubbles up a little bit. So he says, why is there such great insistence on the fact that reality itself is dead and blind in some final sense when the organisms that inhabit it live and see? Is this not more like a consequence of our ignorance with regard to the final nature of the material, rather than a limitation placed on the nature of being that material? Like, these are great questions. And then this line, I'll end with this and then answer your actual question. He says, perhaps our reductive materialism is a reflection of something worse than mere ignorance. Maybe we insist on the deadness and intrinsic meaninglessness of the world to rationalize our own unwillingness to accept the immense burden of opportunity and obligation that a true understanding of our place in a truly meaningful world would necessitate.
That's brilliant.
And then this last line is powerful. He goes, perhaps, so he's asking these questions and he's suggesting things. He says, perhaps it is not religion that is the opiate of the masses. Perhaps it is instead that a rationalist, material atheism is the camouflage of the irresponsible.
Let's drop the mic, man.
I mean, so I love that he's
great
asking these
stuff.
questions, even though you and I might answer them differently and take issue with it. So when I recommend it, it depends. Every book depends on what you want it for. So I'll be totally honest, I was invited to speak on a cruise for a week. That's where I was going, a teaching cruise. This was like the perfect book for me. Not a mindless, like just read some, I don't know, romance or some other story. Not that I read romances, but whatever story somebody might read. But it was like the perfect space to read something, wrestle with it, talk to my wife about it. I thoroughly enjoyed it because he made me look at issues differently. But it's long, and there's a lot of points I'm like, what is he saying? Maybe it's me, maybe I don't understand. So it's a big commitment to read a book like this. It's really, really long. So if you want to think and you want to be challenged, I guess the bottom line for me is anytime somebody goes to the texts that I love and helps me look at them a little bit differently, I value it. I read it twice, and I loved it for those reasons. If that intrigues you, read it. If not, you'll be wrestling your way all the way through this book.
Yeah, which is what I did. And yeah, I would recommend it if you're looking to take a deep dive into a lot of subjects that you might not have thought about before. And if you're willing to, just sort of put on hold some of the questions you'd really like to ask him. Like, do you really believe all this stuff is true? Do you really believe that, God created Adam and Eve in the way the Scripture describes it, for example? I think the value of it is not going to be found in wrestling with those questions, because he doesn't, at least as far as I could tell, does not take a strong stand at all on any of those. But if you can be content to bracket those out and just read it for the value, and if you can, if you don't have to channel your hermeneutics professor, and you can sort of put that aside and just say he's using the text as a jumping off place.
That's right.
Then I think there's a lot of value in this, and I think there's so much here that is worth wrestling with and digesting. But it's a tough read.
It is a tough read.
For both. We're accustomed to reading it at this level of depth. This was a hard slog for me.
It felt like he could have done a 120-page or 180 book even further, simplifying this. Maybe he will, like a popular level one. Maybe he'll feel like something is lost. But one last nugget. Like, he talks a lot about in the book about sacrifice. From the very beginning, Cain and Abel, sacrifice. And he says, take a marriage. It only works if you each are willing to sacrifice. And I thought of last night going to the grocery store, and either my wife or I wanted to go, and it was like, someone's got to sacrifice. And he just draws out these principles from psychology that connect to theology that I thought were great. But
and I think that the larger point is if you are called by God or conscience or the spirit of being or however you're saying it, that will invariably involve sacrifice.
That's exactly right. And he draws that out well. Last thing I would say, and then we'll wrap this up, is I would love to talk with Jordan Peterson.
Oh, I would too.
I don't know that he's going to watch this. If he does, I hope he feels like we respect him and appreciate him and just want to push and probe these ideas a little bit more. I would thoroughly enjoy it. So if you watch this and enjoyed it, share it, tag him, tag his team, say, hey, here's somebody who'd be willing to have a conversation with you. You want a Christian ethicist or apologist to talk this through, I would do it in a heartbeat. I so apprate his voice.
We'd be honored.
Yeah, we do it in a heartbeat. So send it to his team, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. Hey, I hope you all have enjoyed this conversation about Jordan Peterson's new book, We Who Wrestle with God. Hope you found it stimulating and helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.